Great Responsibility. Chapter 40. Said the spider to the spider. Piper was having a hell of a week. That was the only way she could think to describe it. She was back at Eddie's apartment, upgrading his computer with some of the spare parts and the soldering kit from her home lab. Something about this whole situation left a bad taste in her mouth. She had talked to Eddie about it a bit more, and they had agreed that it was a good idea to let her dad in on the whole situation. She was planning on telling him tonight. Eddie was out of the apartment. He'd given her a spare key. She set down her tool and sighed. There were a few other people she wanted to bring in on the secret, but she wasn't sure she should. The team was S.H.I.E.L.D. They lived on S.H.I.E.L.D. property. They trained at S.H.I.E.L.D. They followed S.H.I.E.L.D. orders. S.H.I.E.L.D. had let someone get away with murder. The plane her parents had been on hadn't even been a private one. It was a regular Boeing 747. It hadn't been a full flight, but there had been nearly 200 people on that plane. No one had made it out alive, but they hadn't found all the bodies. In the 12 years since, a few bones had surfaced, but they were too damaged to identify. Piper glanced over at her laptop. It was open to a list of people still missing, presumed dead from the crash. There were 13 names on that list, but one stood out to her. Dr. Otto Octavius. It seemed too big a coincidence that he'd been on that plane too, with everything she'd learned from Dr. Connors and everyone else she'd talked to about his mysterious change in personality after joining Oscorp. And there was the second thorn in Piper's brain. Oscorp. Norman Osborn's company. Harry's dad's company. Something in it had been rotten enough 12 years ago to send 2 undercover S.H.I.E.L.D. agents in. And they'd found something. That might be what bothered her most, was that they'd clearly found something bad enough to kill over. Bad enough to kill almost 200 people over. And whatever they'd found was sitting encrypted in a USB in Queens. A USB only she could access, but that she couldn't decrypt. She rolled her head around her neck, trying to work out a kink in her shoulder. She coughed, rubbing her eyes. Unfortunately, spider healing didn't do much against the common cold, even when it was most likely induced by stress. Piper's phone alarm went off, and she popped the cover back on Eddie's computer. She stifled a sneeze in her elbow as she switched off her computer and slid it into her bag along with the USB. She left the apartment and locked up. She really didn't think she would make it by web-slinging to school, so she caught a cab. Sam really couldn't hide it anymore. He was seriously worried. It had been a few days since he'd talked to Piper. She hadn't shown up for any training she was supposed to. Fury was pissed. She'd avoided Coulson, and she hadn't told him anything about what was going on, but every time Coulson walked into a room she had to be in, she got this look in her eyes, distrust and anger turning her blue eyes steely. He couldn't figure out what was going on, but he was going to, no matter what. Piper leaned her head against her locker. The cool metal felt great on her head. She really should have taken Pepper's advice and just stayed home. She pulled a tissue out of her pocket and blew her nose loudly. Ouch, that doesn't sound good. Piper jumped. It wasn't often someone could sneak up on her. Clint and Natasha were 2 of the only people who could manage it. She turned and looked into Harry's eyes, but they didn't quite look like Harry's. They were darker, swirling with black. Now that she looked, she could see the effects of the symbiote. She forced a smile, then let loose a couple of loud, deep coughs into her sleeve, which Harry seemed to pass off as the reason her smile was so fake. It's nothing, it's just a cold. Piper sniffled, wiping her nose on the tissue in her hand. Harry reached out, and Piper tried not to flinch back, but she didn't quite manage it. She grinned slightly, suppressing another cough. Wouldn't want to spread the cold. He smiled. Was it just her, or did it look a bit sinister? You're so sweet, Piper. There was a breathless pause before his smile grew wider and a touch more genuine. He grabbed her hand in his and leaned closer. I want to show you something. Before Piper could protest, Harry was dragging her off into a nearby janitor's closet. Mary Jane grinned as she spotted her best friend slipping into the closet. She rolled her eyes. About time, she muttered under her breath. Piper's face was bright red, and it was only partially because of the fever. A janitor's closet was not the coziest of places. She knew that, having used the school's janitor's closet to change into her costume. She'd never been in a janitor's closet with someone else, though. She laughed nervously as Harry grinned. I know you figured out I'm Spider-Man, but I want to show you how I did it. He let go of her hand and brought his wrist up to eye level. It looked like one of Harry's regular watches, digital and expensive. Piper raised an eyebrow at him. He grinned and tapped the button on the side of the watch. The top of the watch folded back and the symbiote stretched out, covering Harry from head to toe, morphing him into the Spider-Man within seconds. Piper jumped back as much as was possible in the tiny enclosed space. The mask grinned at her before peeling back to reveal Harry's face. Isn't it cool? Harry was grinning, but Piper's heart was going a mile a minute. Memories of watching helpless, trapped in her own head as the thing her friend was now wearing as casually as he normally wore Armani rampaged, hurting her team, her friends. Harry must have noticed Piper's distress because he frowned. Piper, are you okay? Piper shook her head. Harry, where did you get that thing? Harry's frown deepened. Why does it matter? Think about how proud my dad's going to be when he finds out I'm a hero. Piper was watching the suit closely. Harry, this is important. Where did you get that thing? Harry sighed. I found it. At my house after the party. Piper's heart sank. That was exactly what she hadn't wanted to hear. Harry, doesn't that mean that that's the thing that attacked your party? The thing that threw me through a window? The thing that Spider-Girl had to show up to stop? The thing that almost killed her? Harry scoffed, but something was going on with his eyes again. They were getting a touch clearer and more confused by the second. Spider-Girl is obsolete. Finished. We'll beat her soon, and then we'll be the only spider in town. Piper was feeling worse about this situation by the minute. Harry, who's we? Harry froze, his eyes clearing to their usual sky blue for the first time in weeks. He looked down and his eyes went wide and panicked. The symbiote rippled and Piper tried to go for the door, but Harry was standing between her and it. Or at least, the thing that had been Harry was. It clearly wasn't him anymore. She heard a faint scream from inside the tar-like substance, and then it closed over him again, but this time something was different. The symbiote rippled again and grew larger, more muscular, filling the room as the bell in the hallway outside rang for the start of third period. A snarl rang through the room as a great black maw full of pointed fangs ripped itself open, and a tongue longer than her torso ran over the ruined lips of the symbiote. Venom's lips. Piper was trapped. Venom smiled. We are Venom. Chapter 41. Lost Secret. Harry tried to scream, but no sound came out. He watched as Piper backed across the room as much as she could, away from him, away from Venom. How could everything have gone so wrong so quickly? Why hadn't he realized that the thing he'd found in his house had been the same thing that had attacked Piper at his party? The answer came slithering into his ear in the same hissing, slithering voice that had echoed in his dreams for weeks. Because we didn't want you to realize it. It was the voice of the symbiote, Venom's voice. I needed a host. You were just what I needed. Now I can kill the spider, the one who betrayed me. She refused to bond with us. Harry watched as Venom made a lunge at Piper, but she slapped her wrist, and suddenly there was a glove around her hand, a metal glove. A blast of light sent Venom flying into the door of the janitor's closet, which groaned, but miraculously remained standing. Venom roared as Piper aimed both gloved hands at the ceiling above him. Sam, Danny, Ava, and Luke froze as a roar shook the school's foundations. Chaos erupted in the classroom as the four of them ducked out of the door. "Where's Webbs?" Sam called out over the din that had taken over the school building. The building shook again, and this time there was a distinct sound of lasers. Then a crash of the roof caving in a nearby room. The team rushed outside just in time to see something distinctly female blasting out of a hole in the school's roof. Her Black Widow hoodie was zipped up, and the hood pulled up and miraculously was staying in place despite the wind blowing around her as she took off on her rocket boots through the Queen's skyline. Something large and black and very frighteningly familiar pulled itself out of the hole and roared, swinging after her. Sam looked around at the others before nodding to himself and grabbing Danny and Ava by the hand. He dragged them through the crowd into a back alley behind the school. Luke followed them. Ava frowned as Sam flipped open one of the many hidden panels S.H.I.E.L.D. had installed around the school to help them get to their equipment, should they need to. "What are you doing?" Sam glanced around before speaking as he typed in his access code. "We're going after her." Piper hadn't had much choice but to use the gift Tony had given her a few days ago to get her out of there. She really hoped no one had seen her face. She pulled up her hood last minute before she'd activated the boots and taken off out of the hole she'd blasted in the roof. She had no doubt she'd be getting an earful about that later, if she lived. She had a very irate symbiote chasing her across Manhattan, after all. And only 3 minutes left on her boots if her dad had been right about the time he'd given her. But she needed to keep Venom's focus, otherwise the thing could, and she had no doubt would, run rampant on the people of New York. The people currently snapping photos from below her before realizing that there was something dangerous chasing her. She had never been more grateful for her selective ability to stick to things. That meant that despite the wind shrieking in her ears, her hood wasn't going anywhere. She was also glad that she liked hoodies just a few sizes too big for her. The shadow cast by the hood would hopefully make identifying the hoodlum with Tony Stark's tech nearly impossible. Piper whirled as her spidey sense went crazy. She fired a blast from her glove and struck Venom directly in the face, spinning midair to avoid a webline and kicking her heels together to put on an extra burst of speed. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and slipped the earpiece out of the case and into her ear. "Jarvis," the British AI responded immediately. "Yes, Miss Parker." "Open the window, west side, 25th floor hallway, now please, and evacuate the building except for the Avengers." Alarms began to blare as Piper dove through the still opening window, knowing Venom wasn't far behind. "Miss Parker, I am afraid the Avengers are away on a mission. They are not expected back for several days." Piper swore loudly and dove into the lab just off the hall. She slammed into a computer hard, but managed to somehow keep from destroying it, as she furiously overrode the quarantine systems and set it around the 3 levels of lab that were now empty, thanks to the quite expedient nature of the evacuation protocols Tony had put in place since supervillain attacks had become a regular occurrence. She slammed her hand into the execute button as Venom came crashing into the lab. Piper leapt over the console, blasted a hole in the vent near the floor before baseball sliding into it, narrowly missing Venom's talons. She heard Venom shriek in rage as she raced through the vents. She knew exactly where she was going, and with no one left in the building, she was free to use her super strength with impunity. She wasn't sure if Harry would remember any of this, but she couldn't let him find out she was Spider-Girl. The good thing about this situation, really the only good thing about it, was, if she thought about it, which she was trying not to, was that Harry already knew that Tony was her father. But these were things she needed to worry about later, after she made sure he would survive this ordeal. She kicked in a vent and dropped to the floor of the room below, switching off and tossing aside the gloves and boots Tony had given her. This was one of the labs almost no one had access to, if only because it wasn't technically a lab anymore. It was technically an equipment room. It housed all of the extra equipment the Avengers normally didn't need, or were still perfecting. Piper had to think fast. Venom could be here any second. She'd managed to kill the thing once, but she wasn't sure if it would work a second time without hurting Harry. She didn't really have much of a choice, though, if she wanted to survive. She snatched up Natasha's spare widow bites, the electrics she kept around her wrist and used to stun opponents. Piper fixed them around her wrists and frowned slightly. The problem with those was that she would have to get in close to use them. She snatched up Clint's spare quiver and checked the arrows. There were 3 incendiary, 1 regular tipped, 1 boxing glove arrow, and blessedly 4 shock arrows. She snagged a spare bow and slung the quiver across her back just as the ceiling began to rattle. She just managed to get the last piece of equipment she needed on before it gave way and Venom roared, snarling down at her. Piper pulled an arrow and fired, a blast of fire covering Venom's face just long enough for her to power up the boots and blast off through the hole Venom had created. She took off, flying down the hall away from the beast that had been her friend. She had to get to her dad's main lab if her plan was going to work. She just prayed they'd both survive it.